The Israeli-Palestinian conflict dominates headlines, blows up social media feeds, and sparks outrage around the world. But for all the attention it gets, there's so much that people still get wrong. What they think they know is based on myths that get repeated so often they're accepted as reality. Like the idea that Israeli settlements are the biggest obstacle to peace, or that Palestinian identity was invented by the KGB. These myths keep people locked in their echo chambers, arguing past each other instead of facing reality. So let's cut through the noise and unpack 5 different myths about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Myth number 1. Israel could solve the conflict by ending the occupation. A lot of people think the conflict comes down to one thing: Israel's occupation of Palestinian land. That if Israel just ended the occupation, there would finally be peace. But that's not the whole story. What if ending the occupation isn't the solution everyone thinks it is? Let's start by looking at what we mean by the word occupation. It started after Israel won the Six-Day War, capturing these territories from its neighbors. Israel eventually gave back all of this, but still controls these areas. This is the occupation, the areas that Israel captured in 1967 and still controls today. But military occupations are actually common at the end of a war until there's a peace agreement. After World War II, Germany and Japan were occupied until they fully surrendered and committed to peaceful coexistence. In other words, it's not that ending an occupation leads to peace. It's supposed to be the other way around, that peace leads to an end of occupation. But with the Palestinians, that never happened. A few months after the Six-Day War, Arab leaders declared their infamous 3 no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiations with Israel.
And immediately after the war, we said, let us sit down and negotiate peace. They didn't do it.
Instead of peace talks, there were decades of violence, from plane hijackings to 2 intifadas. Each round of violence only tightened Israel's security controls and made life under military occupation harsher. But here's the key question. How could the occupation be the cause of the conflict if the conflict started decades before the occupation? Way before 1967, even before 1948 when Israel became a state, before there were even borders to fight over, there were riots and attacks against Jewish communities in the land.
People say to us, pull back to the borders of 67, and then there will be peace. We were in the borders of 67. Why was there war?
The question exposes an extremely inconvenient truth. The uncomfortable reality is that to too many of Israel's neighbors, the real problem, the real cause of the conflict, is the very existence of a Jewish state. That to some people, any Jewish self-rule anywhere in the Holy Land counts as occupation. Occupation doesn't just mean this area. It means all of this. Everything from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Like this person called out by Ben Shapiro during a debate at the Oxford Union.
Which part of Israel is occupied Palestine?
All of Israel?
There we go. There we go. There we go. So what you're calling for is the obliteration of the state of Israel, and all of this is just a cover for that. I appreciate your time.
If we accept the myth that Israel could solve the conflict by unilaterally ending the occupation, we're silently empowering the extremists who don't want peace alongside Israel. They don't want Israel at all. Now, are there serious moral concerns about the current occupation of the West Bank? Absolutely.
Palestinians in the West Bank do not vote for the sovereign of the West Bank, which is the Israeli military governor of the West Bank. And that's an imbalance. That's not okay. That's not sustainable. That's immoral.
Generations of Palestinians lived their entire lives under military control. And it hasn't just lasted decades, it's gotten harsher. Today, Palestinians in the West Bank face checkpoints, travel restrictions, and security barriers. But the occupation didn't start the conflict. So simply ending it won't end the conflict and bring peace. Now, does that mean we should just accept the status quo? I don't think so. But finding an actual solution to this dilemma starts with being honest about why the dilemma exists. Myth number 2. Palestinian identity was invented by the KGB. What if Palestinians aren't a real people? They're just generic Arabs, no different from the Arabs in neighboring countries, simply pretending to be a distinct people. And here's the kicker. It's all part of a secret Soviet psyop.
The conspiracy is that the Soviets literally created Palestinian identity. That it was literally a construct of the KGB. And this is a very widespread view among, at least that I've encountered online, among many of the pro-Israel community.
So where does this myth even come from? Well, like so many conspiracy theories, there is a kernel of truth behind it. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was vying for influence against the United States. As Israel grew closer with the US, the Soviets hatched a plan to expand their influence among Israel's Arab neighbors. By the late 1950s, the USSR poured money, weapons, and resources into Arab countries to help them in their battle against the Jewish state. In fact, during the Six-Day War, Israel destroyed or captured $2 billion worth of high-tech Soviet equipment from Arab armies. And the Soviets decided to heavily invest in the idea of Palestinian nationalism as a way to isolate Israel. They helped Arab-Palestinian activists create the Palestine Liberation Organization, even putting together the blueprint for a charter. And the KGB worked closely with Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, grooming him to lead the PLO, including training him at a special ops school near Moscow. Arafat's Soviet handlers smuggled him around $200,000 a month in laundered cash to help the cause. The KGB's propaganda department made the deliberate decision to reframe the Palestinian cause as a righteous struggle for human rights against a much more powerful colonial oppressor. They asked Arafat to declare war on so-called American imperial Zionism, and the Soviets spearheaded the infamous UN resolution declaring Zionism is racism, which was later repealed. So yeah, the KGB was a huge supporter of Palestinian nationalism, but that does not mean that Palestinian nationalism was invented by the Soviets.
The Soviets were working with Palestinian nationalists and militants, but I'm saying that to reduce the modern or the contemporary national identity of the Palestinian people to a mere Soviet intelligence and psychological warfare operation is truly inaccurate and quite ignorant.
In other words, Palestinian identity wasn't invented out of thin air. The idea that Palestinians didn't see themselves as a distinct people until the 1960s just isn't true. And it's not just about when they started calling themselves Palestinians. Until 1948, the term Palestinian was often used to refer to Jews also. My ancestors, who were born in Jerusalem, have Palestinian birth certificates. The truth is, before the modern nation state, lots of people in the region had hyper-local identities based on their tribe or their village. If you were to ask them where they were from, they would likely say Lid, or Jaffa, or Jerusalem, or Damascus, or Cairo. But as Arab nationalism took hold of the region in the 1900s, with Arabs in areas like Iraq and Lebanon experiencing their own nationalist awakening, many of Palestine's Arabs were attracted to the idea of having their own independent state, especially as more and more Jews immigrated into the region, determined to create their own Jewish state.
Palestinian identity coalesces in response to the pressure of Jewish immigration. This is something that Palestinian scholars acknowledge, discuss, know.
In the early 1900s, some Arabs started pushing for a distinct Palestinian national identity. They even had a newspaper called Palestine, which addressed its Arab readers as Palestinians.
Symbolic representations and visual representation of the Palestinian identity may have come around later, but the Palestinian, like in people's hearts, in the way they speak, in the way they communicate with each other, like my grandparents in the 30s, they referred to themselves as Palestinians.
Palestinian identity didn't suddenly emerge in the 1960s. It developed organically for generations. Even if the Soviets exploited the Palestinian people for their own power struggle against the West, that doesn't mean they invented Palestinian identity. That's a dangerous conspiracy theory that erases centuries of Palestinian experience. Myth number 3. Israeli settlements are the biggest obstacle to peace. After the Six-Day War, Israel made a controversial decision to allow Israeli civilians to build new communities in the territories it conquered in 1967. The government even offered incentives for Israelis to move into certain areas. Critics say these settlements make it nearly impossible to create a future Palestinian state with clear connected borders, unless it looks like Swiss cheese. And they're right. Settlements are definitely an obstacle to creating a Palestinian state. But settlements aren't the main reason the conflict drags on. And when they get treated as the biggest obstacle, it distracts from bigger issues that stand in the way of peace. Take what happened in 2010, when Vice President Joe Biden arrived in Israel for a goodwill visit. During the trip, Israel's Interior Ministry announced the approval of new housing units in a Jewish neighborhood in Jerusalem. This area was captured from Jordan during the Six-Day War and annexed by Israel in 1980. It was empty land until the 90s when Israelis first began building there. But this neighborhood is outside Israel's original 1948 borders, like just outside the borders, around half a mile. That's shorter than the walk from the Jaffa Gate to the Western Wall. International media erupted, framing the new construction project as a giant controversy.
The decision by the Israeli government to advance planning for new housing units in East Jerusalem undermines that very trust, the trust that we need right now in order to begin as well as have profitable negotiations.
But locals were baffled. To them, this was run-of-the-mill construction in just another neighborhood of Jerusalem. But in Washington, the fallout was huge. President Obama demanded that Israel cancel the new housing units and freeze all new Jewish construction in East Jerusalem.
Settlements have to be stopped in order for us to move forward.
The United States does not accept the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlements. It is time for these settlements to stop.
This was a major turning point. Suddenly, settlements were treated as the primary roadblock to peace. And that narrative stuck, putting all the focus and all the blame on Israel while ignoring other major obstacles like the Palestinian leadership's refusal to accept Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, ongoing excitement in schools, and support for terror. Now you may be thinking, okay, but what about the settlements deeper inside the West Bank? Aren't those a bigger problem? Yes, those are much more controversial. But there are still some important things to keep in mind. First, the conflict predates the settlements. There was violence long before 1967 and even before Israel existed as a state. Second, about 80% of Israeli settlers live in these 8 large communities that make up only 4% of the West Bank. At least some of these areas are expected to end up as part of Israel in any realistic peace deal, with land swaps that would add Israeli land to a future Palestinian state. That's been on the table in past negotiations, including in 2008, when Palestinian President Abbas reportedly offered a plan that would allow more than 60% of Israeli settlers to stay in place. And if settlements ultimately need to be removed, Israel has done it before, pulling out of Gaza in 2005, evacuating over 9,000 Israelis from 21 settlements. And in 1982, Israel removed 18 settlements from the Sinai Peninsula as part of its peace treaty with Egypt. But here's a question that rarely gets asked. Would a future Palestinian state have to be Jew-free? The West Bank is filled with Jewish historical and holy sites. Jews lived in Hebron for centuries until they were slaughtered and expelled in 1929. In 1948, roughly 10,000 Jews were killed or kicked out of the West Bank when Jordan took control. Jordan didn't even allow Jewish tourists to visit. Now that Jews have reestablished communities in the West Bank, why does peace require the land to be ethnically cleansed once again? If a Palestinian state is meant to coexist peacefully with Israel, why couldn't it include a Jewish minority, just as Israel includes a large Arab minority? In certain ways, settlements are an obstacle to peace. They make daily life harder for Palestinians and deepen the cycle of resentment. But they're not the root cause of the conflict. Pinning all this responsibility on these communities might be convenient, because when the word settlement gets thrown around without context, it becomes a stand-in for a much bigger myth, the belief that all of Israel is a settlement and every Israeli a settler. Similar to the idea that all of Israel is occupied territory, it's a dangerous idea that is truly a massive obstacle to peace. Myth number 4. The land was empty when Jews arrived. There's a famous line, Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. It captures a powerful myth that before Jews arrived in the Holy Land, it was barren and empty, that Jews worked hard and made the land flourish, and only then did Arabs begin flocking to the region. According to this story, most modern-day Palestinians aren't really native to the land, but just the descendants of immigrants who came seeking opportunity after the Jews made the desert bloom. Is there any truth to the myth? Let's start with the easiest part to debunk. At the end of the Ottoman period, Palestine was not empty. It was home to hundreds of thousands of Arabs, as well as long-established Jewish communities. In 1915, there were around 600,000 Muslims, 80,000 Christians, and somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 Jews. So where's the kernel of truth in the myth? Well, when Jews began immigrating in larger numbers during the British Mandate, they did bring investment, technology, and innovation. Jewish pioneers often bought land that was swampy, rocky, or otherwise uncultivated at hugely inflated prices. They drained the swamps, modernized agriculture, and set up kibbutzim and towns. Visitors to the region were astonished at the pace of change.
The face of this land changes dramatically. It's transformed. Both because the Jews are draining swamps and the British are paving roads, and this land is just modernized very, very quickly. Even people who had nothing to do with the Zionist movement were oftentimes quite astounded by how much the land had just transformed in one decade.
But that progress also came with tensions. Under the Ottomans, the system of land ownership had been semi-feudal. You had wealthy, absentee landlords who owned the property and local tenant farmers who worked the land for generations, just scraping by. So even when Jewish immigrants purchased the land legally for exorbitant prices, it was the wealthy foreign landowner who got richer, while the local worker was displaced, losing his home and his livelihood.
It was undeniable that that investment was flowing in, but the Arab complaint very often was that investment, that money, didn't reach the individual Arab. It didn't reach the simple farmer. That the only people getting rich were people who were already rich, the landowners.
But even if the land wasn't totally empty, what about the idea that most Palestinians are actually descended from Arabs who flocked to the region during the British Mandate period? It is true that the broader Arab population saw an enormous increase during this time period. But the truth is, the vast majority of this growth came from natural increase, with declining infant mortality rates and improved living conditions affecting the entire region. According to a Jewish agency survey, 77% of the Arab-Palestinian population growth between 1914 and 1938 was due to natural increase, and just 23% due to immigration. But what about undocumented immigration, which wasn't included in the public records?
The nature of undocumented immigration is that there are no documents. This was a boom area during the Mandate in what was a very kind of economically stagnant region. I think it stands to reason that there was some level of immigration, illegal Arab immigration. But when I hear people say that more Arabs immigrated to this land than Jews, from my research, I've seen no reason to believe that, to suggest that. You can just look at population numbers. There were censuses conducted here, and the numbers just don't bear that out. So, illegal Arab immigration was not zero, but I also don't think it was in the hundreds of thousands.
So yes, there was some undocumented immigration. But the numbers show that the overwhelming majority of Palestinians today are descended from people who already lived in the region for generations. Now, there's another side to the myth that the land was empty, and that's the idea that there weren't any Jews in the land. Many people I've talked to think that Jews left Israel thousands of years ago, wandered the world for centuries, and then after the Holocaust came back, pushed out the Palestinians, and created a state. It's a simple story that's worked its way into our basic assumptions about the conflict. So much so that Dave Chappelle can make a joke like this in a Netflix special. In the setup, he describes an idea he has for a movie about space aliens. The catch is that the aliens are originally from an ancient civilization on Earth that left thousands of years ago. But then, things go really terrible for them out in space.
So they come back to Earth, decide that they want to claim the Earth for their very own. It's a pretty good plotline, huh? I call it Space Jews.
The joke only gets laughs because this myth is so mainstream. But if you know the truth, then the joke doesn't really work. The fact that spoils the punchline? Jews never left Israel. Not completely. Jews have lived in Israel for thousands of years. Yes, at different times, after different wars and under different leaders, many Jews were exiled or killed. And at other times, they were allowed to return. So communities of Jews have constantly been migrating to and from the area throughout the ages. But while the population of Jews in the region waxes and wanes, there's always been a baseline community. I mean, it's no secret that Jews and Muslims in the Holy Land fought side by side against Christians during the Crusades. And for centuries, waves of Jews kept coming back, like after the Spanish Inquisition in the 1400s, or in the 1600s when thousands of Ashkenazi Jews fled to Israel after a massacre in Ukraine. By the late 1800s, Jews were actually the majority in Jerusalem. I'm pretty sure Chappelle doesn't know that. The truth is, after World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the entire world was changing. All over the map, new nation-states were forming, including Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. And Palestine was no exception. It wasn't empty land. There were Arab communities and Jewish communities. And over time, each group caught the desire to achieve independence and self-rule. Any myth that denies the identity of either group or delegitimizes either community's desire for self-determination is a myth that perpetuates the conflict. Myth number 5, Israel is an apartheid state. These days, you hear it everywhere.
It's a strong word that conjures up for many the dark years of white oppression in South Africa.
Israeli officials are today committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution.
A new report from Amnesty International labels Israel an apartheid state that oppresses Palestinians.
But what does this actually mean? The word apartheid actually comes from South Africa, where for decades the government used the law to enforce brutal racial segregation and discrimination. Non-white South Africans couldn't vote, couldn't live where they wanted, couldn't hold certain jobs, and were legally separated from white South Africans in almost every aspect of life. Today, The term apartheid is being used by some activists to describe Israel. But when they say that, they're not usually talking about how Israel treats its Arab or Muslim citizens living in this area. They're talking about how Israel treats non-citizens living in the areas under military occupation. This is a huge distinction. Around 20% of Israel's citizens are Arab. They vote in elections, serve in parliament, sit on the Supreme Court, run hospitals, teach at universities, and own businesses. Under Israeli law, all citizens are treated equally, regardless of race or religion. Of course, discrimination does exist, and there are legitimate critiques of certain systemic inequalities. It's part of an ongoing discussion over majority and minority rights that are emblematic of all nation-states. But that's obviously not apartheid. When people say apartheid, they're almost always talking about the Palestinians living in the West Bank or Gaza. And this is where things get complicated. Because yes, Palestinians in those areas live under very different conditions. They're not citizens of Israel. They live under a separate legal system with heavy restrictions on movements. They have to deal with checkpoints, security barriers, and limits on which roads they're allowed to use. But here's the key distinction. That difference isn't based on race or religion. It's based on citizenship. Every single country on earth discriminates between citizens and non-citizens, and these Palestinians were never citizens of Israel. Starting in 1950, most in the West Bank actually became citizens of Jordan, until Jordan stripped them of that citizenship in 1988. Yeah, some of Israel's neighbors actually do treat their Palestinian inhabitants as second-class citizens, limiting their rights to vote or hold certain jobs or own property. And I think it's important to mention that the international community never accuses these countries of apartheid. And here's another layer most people don't know. The West Bank isn't one single block of land fully controlled by Israel. Under agreements between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, the land is divided into 3 zones. Area A is under the full control of the Palestinian Authority. This includes most major Palestinian cities. In Area B, the Palestinian Authority handles civil services and local governance and schools. But security is shared between Israelis and the PA. These are mostly small towns and rural communities. Area C is the only area under full Israeli control. But here's the kicker. Even though Area C is the biggest area on the map, more than 90% of Palestinians live in Area A or B, where they're governed by the Palestinian Authority. The point is, Palestinians have their own government, their own leaders, their own representation. In other words, they're not citizens of Israel, and they live under a separate authority that's been in conflict with Israel for decades. Now, does that mean that everything is fine? No. Many Palestinians see the Palestinian Authority as just a puppet administration, subordinate to Israel. Generations of Palestinians have grown up under some form of Israeli control, without the rights and freedoms that Israeli citizens have. That reality is painful and understandably fuels anger and resentment. The situation has some similarities to apartheid, but the differences are just as important. In South Africa, apartheid was designed to guarantee permanent white domination. It was explicitly designed to elevate one race of people over another. In the West Bank, it's the result of a prolonged, unresolved military conflict, one that started with a war and has never truly ended. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, a mutually agreed upon bridge to Palestinian statehood. Why that state hasn't yet materialized is a fair question. Some blame Palestinian refusal to accept any Jewish self-determination anywhere in the land. Others blame Israelis who oppose the creation of a Palestinian state. But to call the entire state of Israel an apartheid state is simply not accurate. The problem with the apartheid myth is that it makes people think that Israel itself is an ethno-state, a society of Jewish supremacy that views non-Jews as second-class citizens. But notwithstanding its flaws, Israel has the freest society in the Middle East for its citizens, regardless of religion or ethnicity. And labeling it an apartheid state hides the real issue, the lack of a political solution to end the conflict and the military occupation. All 5 of these myths share something in common. They demonize and they delegitimize. They undermine identity and deny lived experience. People wonder why it's so hard to solve the conflict? Einstein famously said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." We can't accept myths that obscure the real root causes of the conflict. We can't allow false talking points to distract us from the pursuit of common ground, to blind us from a path of coexistence. The conflict can never get resolved unless we actually pay attention to the real issues. And the first step is correcting the myths that keep them buried.